September 9th, 1942, 6 o'clock in the morning. The Oregon coast. The mist rolls thick across the Pacific shoreline, clinging to the ancient Douglas firs that blanket the Siskiyou Mountains. The air is heavy with salt and pine. Coastal fog wraps around Mount Emily like a silent guardian. The only sound is the distant crash of waves against rocky shores, relentless and eternal. But far out at sea, beyond the sight of any American lookout tower, beyond the range of coastal radar, something breaks the surface. A dark shape. A shadow rising from the deep Pacific. It's a Japanese submarine, the I-25. Water cascades from its conning tower as it stabilizes in the rolling swells, 25 miles offshore. The deck crew emerges quickly, efficiently, moving with the precision of men who have rehearsed this moment 100 times in the cramped confines below. From a watertight hangar on the submarine's deck, they begin to unfold something extraordinary. Wings extend and lock into place. A propeller is mounted onto a radial engine. Floats are secured to the fuselage. Within 20 minutes, a small seaplane sits ready on a catapult rail, fragile as a dragonfly, but deadly in its purpose. Inside the cramped cockpit climbs Warrant Flying Officer Nobuo Fujita, 31 years old, a reconnaissance pilot trained in the Imperial Japanese Navy's most secretive operations. His face is calm, focused, betraying none of the tension that must be coursing through his veins. Beside him, his observer, Petty Officer Shoji Okuda, checks the navigation charts one final time, his fingers tracing the route they will fly into enemy territory. Beneath the wings of their tiny aircraft hang two bombs. Not large bombs designed to destroy cities or sink battleships. These are incendiary devices, 76 kilograms each, filled with thermite and magnesium, designed for one specific purpose: to turn the American forest into an inferno that will burn for weeks. Fujita adjusts his leather goggles, takes a deep breath. The morning air is cold, and he can see his breath in the cockpit. Behind him, the submarine's captain raises his hand, then drops it sharply. The catapult fires with explosive force. The seaplane hurtles forward along the 25-meter rail, accelerates from 0 to flying speed in seconds, and leaps from the deck into the gray morning sky. Below, the submarine I-25 immediately begins its dive, slipping back beneath the waves, disappearing as if it were never there. No trace remains on the dark Pacific surface except fading ripples. Nobuo Fujita banks east and climbs into the clouds, his engine humming steadily. He is about to make history. He will become the only enemy pilot ever to bomb the continental United States of America. Not the territories, not the distant islands of Alaska or Hawaii, but the mainland itself, American soil, the forests of Oregon. It will not be a raid of mass destruction. It will not bring military victory or strategic advantage, but it will be a strike that sends a psychological shockwave through a nation already gripped by fear, a nation that believed its mainland was untouchable, protected by vast oceans from the horrors of war. This is the story of the Lookout Air Raids, the first and only manned enemy air attack on the American homeland during World War II, a mission that would be classified and hidden from the American public for months, a mission that would alter U.S. defense policy for decades to come. And this is the story of what happened after, when an act of war became, against all odds, a symbol of peace and reconciliation between former enemies. To understand why Nobuo Fujita was flying toward Oregon that September morning, we need to go back 9 months earlier, to December 7th, 1941, to the day that shattered America's sense of invulnerability and changed the course of history, Pearl Harbor. The Japanese surprise attack on the U.S. naval base in Hawaii was devastating beyond measure. More than 2,400 Americans were killed in a single morning. 21 ships were sunk or damaged, including 8 battleships, the backbone of America's Pacific Fleet. Nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed on the ground before they could even take off. The Arizona, the Oklahoma, the West Virginia, once mighty warships, now lay broken and burning in the harbor. It was a catastrophic blow that brought the United States into World War II. But more than that, it was a psychological earthquake that shook the nation to its core. If Japan could strike Hawaii with such devastating force, could they strike the West Coast next? Could they invade California, Could Japanese troops land on American beaches? The question haunted every coastal community from San Diego to Seattle. And the fear was not irrational. In the weeks and months following Pearl Harbor, Japanese submarines prowled the Pacific shoreline with alarming and increasing frequency. On December 20th, 1941, just 13 days after Pearl Harbor, a Japanese submarine surfaced near the mouth of the Columbia River in Oregon. It fired 17 shells from its deck gun at Fort Stevens, a coastal defense installation. The shells landed on the beach and damaged a baseball field backstop, but caused no casualties. The fort's commander chose not to return fire, fearing that muzzle flashes would reveal the fort's position. But the message was unmistakable. Japan could reach the American mainland whenever they wanted. On February 23, 1942, Japanese submarine I-17 surfaced off the coast of Santa Barbara, California, near an area called Elwood. For 20 minutes, the submarine fired shells at the Elwood oil field, targeting storage tanks and drilling equipment. A few storage facilities were lightly damaged, and a pump house was hit, but there were no casualties. Still, the attack sent shockwaves through California. If a submarine could shell an oil field, what else could it hit? Ports, cities, military bases. 2 days later came the Battle of Los Angeles, a chaotic, terrifying night that would become infamous. On February 25, 1942, air raid sirens wailed across Los Angeles. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, launching more than 1,400 rounds of ammunition into the night sky. Searchlights swept frantically through the clouds looking for enemy aircraft. Shrapnel from the anti-aircraft shells rained down on the city, damaging buildings and vehicles. 5 civilians died, 3 in car accidents during the blackout, and 2 from heart attacks brought on by the stress and fear. But no Japanese aircraft were ever found. No enemy planes were shot down. No wreckage was recovered. Military investigators later concluded it was likely a false alarm triggered by weather balloons, war nerves, and the initial misidentification of friendly aircraft. But at the time, it seemed like proof that Japanese bombers could appear over American cities without warning. The West Coast was paralyzed by fear. Blackouts became routine every single night. Entire cities went dark. Car headlights were painted over or covered with slotted masks that allowed only minimal light. Windows in homes and businesses were covered with thick blackout curtains. Street lights were extinguished. Anyone who violated blackout regulations was fined or arrested. Air raid wardens patrolled neighborhoods, enforcing the darkness. Lookout towers sprouted along the entire coastline, staffed by civilian volunteers who scanned the horizon day and night for enemy ships, planes, or landing craft. Some towers were professionally built structures. Others were little more than wooden platforms perched on hilltops. But they were manned around the clock, with observers using binoculars and telephones to report anything suspicious. Rumors spread like wildfire through coastal communities. Japanese paratroopers had been spotted in California. Saboteurs were poisoning water supplies. Enemy submarines were landing spies and commandos on remote beaches. Invasion forces were gathering in the Aleutian Islands, preparing to strike southward. Most of these rumors were baseless, born of panic and paranoia, but they reflected the genuine terror that gripped the region. The government responded with overwhelming force. Barrage balloons, large tethered balloons designed to obstruct low-flying aircraft, were deployed above major cities. Coastal artillery was installed on cliffs and beaches, with crews trained to engage enemy warships. Military blimps patrolled the skies, watching for submarines and surface vessels. Radar stations were built along the coast, though the technology was still primitive and unreliable. With limited range and frequent false alarms, fighter squadrons were stationed at airfields throughout the West Coast, ready to scramble at a moment's notice. Anti-aircraft batteries were positioned around key installations, ports, airfields, factories, bridges. Civil defense organizations were formed, training civilians in firefighting, first aid, and emergency response. And then there was Executive Order 9066. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed an order that would become one of the most controversial decisions in American history. The order authorized the forced relocation and incarceration of more than 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast. 2/3 of them were American citizens. They had committed no crimes. There was no evidence of disloyalty or sabotage. But they were rounded up, forced to abandon their homes and businesses, and sent to internment camps in remote, desolate areas inland. Families were given just days to pack what they could carry. They sold their possessions for pennies on the dollar, or simply left them behind. They were transported by train to camps surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, where they would remain for years. It was a grave injustice, born of racial prejudice and wartime fear, an injustice that the US government would formally apologize for decades later. The West Coast had become a militarized zone, a region living in constant fear of attack. Every shadow was suspect. Every distant sound could be the enemy. The Pacific Ocean, once a symbol of openness and opportunity, now felt like a vast, undefended frontier from which the enemy could emerge at any moment. And the American people were right to be afraid. Because on September 9th, 1942, the enemy did emerge from the Pacific. Not with an invasion fleet or a massive bombing raid, but with a single small plane, carrying 2 incendiary bombs, piloted by a man who would achieve what no other enemy combatant in American history had accomplished. Nobuo Fujita was coming. And America had no idea. Nobuo Fujita was born on September 21st, 1911, in Ibaraki Prefecture, a coastal region northeast of Tokyo. His childhood was shaped by the rhythms of rural Japan, farming, fishing, and the deep-rooted traditions of a family that traced its lineage back centuries. His ancestors included samurai warriors who had served feudal lords during Japan's feudal period. Men who lived by the code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, emphasizing loyalty, honor, discipline, and duty above all else. That sense of duty ran deep in Fujita's blood. It would define his entire life. As a young man growing up in the 1920s and early 1930s, Fujita witnessed Japan's rapid transformation. The country was modernizing at breathtaking speed, industrializing, building a powerful military, and asserting itself as a major power in Asia and the Pacific. Aviation, still a relatively new technology, captured the imagination of an entire generation. Young Japanese men dreamed of flying, of serving their country in the skies. Fujita was drawn to that dream. In the early 1930s, he enlisted in the Imperial Japanese Navy with the goal of becoming a pilot. The training was rigorous and unforgiving. Many candidates washed out. But Fujita possessed the qualities the Navy valued most: patience, precision, discipline, and an unshakable sense of duty. He was not a flashy pilot who sought glory in combat. He was methodical, careful, analytical, the kind of man who studied his instruments closely, followed orders without question, and never took unnecessary risks. These qualities made him ideal for reconnaissance work. Reconnaissance pilots did not engage in dogfights or bombing raids. They flew alone or with a single observer, penetrating deep into enemy territory to gather intelligence, photographing naval bases, counting ships, mapping installations, and reporting on enemy movements. It required stealth, navigation skill, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. Fujita excelled at it. He was assigned to fly the Yokosuka E-14Y, a small float plane that the Allies would later give the code name Glenn. It was an unusual aircraft, purpose-built for a very specific mission: operations from submarines. The Glenn was compact and lightweight. It had a wingspan of just 11 meters, short enough to fit inside a submarine hangar. The aircraft's length was 8.5 meters, and it weighed only about 1,000 kilograms empty. Its wings were designed to fold along the fuselage for storage, and its tail could be partially disassembled. The floats that allowed it to land on water could be detached when the aircraft was stowed. The plane was powered by a single Hitachi Tempu 12 9-cylinder radial engine producing 340 horsepower. Not much power, but sufficient for its purpose. The engine gave the Glenn a maximum speed of approximately 246 kilometers per hour and a cruising speed of around 140 kilometers per hour. Its range was roughly 880 kilometers, and it could stay aloft for about 5.5 hours on a full tank of fuel. The Glenn carried no defensive weapons. No machine guns, no cannon, no way to defend itself if intercepted by enemy fighters. It was not designed for combat. It was designed for stealth and reconnaissance. The aircraft's small size, relatively quiet engine, and ability to fly low made it difficult to detect. And because it was launched from a submarine that could surface, launch the plane and then submerge again within an hour. The Glen could appear seemingly out of nowhere, complete its mission, and vanish. But the Glen could carry bombs, small ones. The aircraft's lightweight frame and limited engine power meant it could not carry heavy ordnance, but it could manage 2 bombs of about 76 kilograms each, mounted on racks beneath the wings. That capability transformed the Glen from a reconnaissance platform into a potential strike. Weapon. Fujita's observer and navigator was Petty. Officer Shoji Okuda. The 2 men had flown together on numerous missions and had developed the kind of trust that only comes from shared danger. In the cramped cockpit of a Glen, with no room for error and no backup if something went wrong, trust was not optional, it was survival. Okuda handled navigation, radio communication, and reconnaissance observations while Fujita focused on flying. They worked together seamlessly, anticipating each other's needs, communicating with minimal words. Both men served aboard submarine I-25, one of the most advanced and capable vessels in the Imperial Japanese Navy. The I-25 was a Type B-1 submarine, completed in October 1941, just weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was a massive vessel by submarine standards, 108.7 meters long, with a displacement of 2,584 tons surfaced and 3,654 tons submerged. It could travel at 23.6 knots on the surface and 8 knots submerged. Its operational range was an impressive 14,000 nautical miles at 16 knots, allowing it to conduct long-range patrols far from Japanese bases. The I-25 carried a crew of 94 men, packed into a vessel where space was at an absolute premium. Crew members slept in shifts, sharing bunks with men on opposite watches. The air inside was thick with humidity, diesel fumes, cooking smells, and the odor of too many men living in too small a space. Fresh water was rationed strictly. Fresh food ran out within days of leaving port, leaving the crew to subsist on canned fish, rice, pickled vegetables, and whatever else could be stored for long periods. The submarine was armed with 6 torpedo tubes, 4 in the bow and 2 in the stern, and carried 17 torpedoes. It also had a 140mm deck gun for surface engagements. But the I-25's most distinctive feature was its aircraft capability. The submarine had a watertight hangar located just forward of the conning tower, large enough to hold a fully disassembled Glen. On the deck was a compressed air catapult system, 25 meters long, capable of launching the lightweight aircraft from a standstill to flying speed in just a few seconds. The submarine's commander was Captain Meiji Tagami, a veteran officer known for his tactical skill, boldness, and ability to inspire loyalty among his crew. Under Tagami's command, the I-25 had already completed several successful and daring missions in the early months of the war. In late January 1942, the I-25 sailed into Australian waters. On January 31st, Fujita and Okuda flew a reconnaissance mission over Sydney Harbour, one of the most heavily defended Allied naval bases in the Pacific. They photographed warships, harbor installations, and defensive positions, gathering intelligence that would later be used to plan a midget submarine attack on the harbor. The flight was a complete success. They were not detected, not intercepted, and returned safely to the submarine. In February 1942, the I-25 moved to New Zealand waters. Fujita flew reconnaissance missions over Wellington and Auckland, again gathering valuable intelligence on Allied naval strength and movements. These missions proved that submarine-launched aircraft could operate effectively in enemy-controlled waters, conducting reconnaissance that would be impossible for surface vessels or conventional aircraft. But now, in late August 1942, the I-25 received new orders. Orders that came directly from Imperial Japanese Navy, headquarters in Tokyo. Orders that would push the capabilities of submarine aviation into entirely new territory. The submarine was ordered to sail east across the Pacific, approach the coast of the United States, and conduct a bombing mission against the American mainland. The target was not a military installation or naval base. It was a forest. The weapon was fire, and the goal was psychological warfare on a scale never before attempted. Captain Tagami called Fujita and Okuda to his cramped cabin and informed them of their mission. They were to bomb the forests of Oregon, attempting to ignite massive wildfires that would spread panic, divert American resources, and demonstrate Japan's ability to strike the U.S. homeland at will. Fujita's face remained calm as he listened to the orders, but inside he must have felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. Pride because he had been chosen for such a significant mission. Apprehension because the risks were enormous. If American fighters intercepted him, he had no weapons and no chance of escape. If the submarine was detected and forced to dive, he and Okuda would be stranded over the Pacific with nowhere to land. If the weather turned bad, or they encountered mechanical problems, they would crash into the ocean or the mountains. But Fujita was a pilot trained in the traditions of Bushido. He did not question orders. He did not calculate odds or express doubts. He simply nodded, said, "Hi," "Yes," and began to prepare. The mission was given a simple designation, Operation Fujita. The forest fire mission, and Nobuo Fujita would be the pilot who would deliver it. The concept of launching aircraft from submarines seems almost fantastical today, an idea that defies logic and practicality. But in the 1920s and 1930s, it represented the cutting edge of naval innovation, a potential revolution in military technology. Japan was not the first nation to experiment with submarine-launched aircraft. France conducted tests as early as 1915, experimenting with small floatplanes stored in waterproof containers aboard submarines. Britain explored similar concepts in the 1920s. Germany and the United States also conducted experiments, though most programs were eventually abandoned as impractical or too expensive. But Japan took the concept further and more seriously than any other nation. And the strategic logic behind it was compelling. Aircraft carriers were undeniably powerful, able to project air power across vast distances. But they were also large, expensive, vulnerable targets. They could be detected by enemy reconnaissance, tracked by submarines, and attacked by bombers. A single aircraft carrier represented an enormous investment in resources, manpower, and shipbuilding capacity. Losing one was a strategic disaster. Submarines, by contrast, were stealthy, difficult to detect, and could operate independently for months at a time. They could approach enemy coastlines undetected, strike without warning, and disappear beneath the waves before the enemy could respond. If you could combine the stealth and endurance of a submarine with the reconnaissance capability of an aircraft, you would have a weapon system unlike anything the world had ever seen. You could conduct surveillance of enemy harbors without risking surface vessels. You could strike targets far beyond the range of conventional submarines. You could create uncertainty and fear in enemy populations by demonstrating that even their most remote coastlines were vulnerable. Japan's first serious experiments began in the mid-1920s. In 1927, the Japanese Navy completed the I-21, an experimental submarine with a small watertight hangar and a catapult system. The tests were promising enough that the Navy decided to pursue the concept more aggressively. By the mid-1930s, Japanese engineers had developed the Type B submarine design, a class of large, long-range submarines specifically designed to carry aircraft. These vessels were engineering marvels, incorporating features that pushed the limits of 1930s technology. The Type B submarines, which included the I-25, featured a watertight cylindrical hangar located on the deck. Just forward of the conning tower, the hangar was approximately 3.5 meters in diameter and 11 meters long, just large enough to hold a disassembled Yokosuka E-14Y Glen with its wings folded and tail partially removed. The hangar was accessed through a hatch that could be sealed completely watertight, allowing the submarine to dive with the aircraft secured inside. The launch system was a compressed air catapult mounted on the deck. It was 25 meters long, roughly a quarter of the submarine's total length, and used high-pressure air to accelerate the lightweight aircraft from 0 to flying speed in approximately 2 seconds. The catapult could launch the Glen even in moderately rough seas, though calm conditions were obviously preferable. The recovery process was more complex and time-consuming. After completing its mission, the Glen would land on the water near the submarine, which would surface and maneuver alongside. A crane mounted on the deck would hoist the aircraft out of the water. The crew would then disassemble the plane, removing floats, folding wings, and detaching the tail section before securing it back in the hangar. The entire process, from landing to secure storage, could take up to an hour, during which time the submarine was vulnerable on the surface. It was a complicated, labor-intensive system. But it worked. The Yokosuka E-14Y Glen itself was a marvel of minimalist engineering. Every component was designed to be as lightweight as possible while remaining functional. The fuselage was constructed of a lightweight metal frame covered with fabric in some sections. The wings used a simple but effective folding mechanism. The engine, while not particularly powerful, was reliable and fuel-efficient. The floats were detachable and could be stored separately in the hangar. The Glen's instrument panel was basic but sufficient. An altimeter, airspeed indicator, compass, engine gauges, and a simple bomb sight. The cockpit was cramped, with barely enough room for the pilot and observer to sit side by side. There was no heating, no pressurization, no comfort of any kind. Flying in the Glen at high altitude or in cold weather was a test of endurance, but the aircraft's small size and light weight gave it advantages. It was difficult to spot visually, especially against a background of clouds or ocean. Its relatively quiet engine meant it could approach targets without being heard until it was quite close. And its ability to operate from a submarine meant it could appear in places where no one expected an enemy aircraft to be. The Imperial Japanese Navy built several Type B submarines equipped with aircraft hangars, including the I-9, I-15, I-17, I-19, I-21, I-23, I-25, and others. These submarines operated throughout the Pacific during the war, conducting reconnaissance missions over Allied ports and bases, including Sydney, Melbourne, Auckland, Suva, Colombo, and Madagascar. But the I-25, under Captain Tagami's command, had compiled one of the most impressive operational records. Its reconnaissance missions in early 1942 had been flawless. Fujita and Okuda had flown over heavily defended harbors, gathered critical intelligence, and returned without being detected. These successes earned the crew a reputation for skill and daring. Now in August 1942, the I-25 was being asked to attempt something unprecedented. Not reconnaissance, not surveillance, but an actual bombing mission against the continental United States, the first and only time a submarine-launched aircraft would be used to attack the American mainland, Tokyo. Believed that if the mission succeeded, if Fujita could drop incendiary bombs on the forests of Oregon and ignite massive wildfires, the psychological impact would be enormous. American civilians, who had grown increasingly complacent as the initial panic after Pearl Harbor faded, would be reminded that they were vulnerable. The U.S. military would be forced to divert resources to homeland defense, weakening the American offensive in the Pacific. And Japan would demonstrate to the world that it possessed the capability and the will to strike America anywhere, anytime. The I-25 departed from its base at Yokosuka in late August 1942, embarking on what would be one of the most unusual submarine patrols of the entire war. The voyage across the Pacific would take weeks, traveling mostly submerged during daylight hours to avoid detection and surfacing at night to recharge batteries, ventilate the crew compartments, and make navigational fixes using the stars. Life aboard the submarine during this voyage was grueling. The crew endured oppressive heat and humidity, cramped living conditions, and the constant stress of operating in enemy-controlled waters. Meals were monotonous. Privacy was non-existent. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and the various chemicals used to operate the submarine's systems. But morale remained surprisingly high. The crew of the I-25 knew they were part of a historic mission. They were not just another submarine on routine patrol. They were carrying the aircraft and the pilot who would bomb America. Every man aboard felt the weight of that responsibility and the pride of being chosen for such a significant operation. As the submarine approached the coast of North America in early September, Captain Tagami began listening to American radio broadcasts, monitoring for any sign that Japanese naval activity had been detected. He heard reports of the ongoing battles in the Solomon Islands, news about the war in Europe, and routine civilian programming. But there was no indication that the Americans had any idea a Japanese submarine was approaching the Oregon coast. The element of surprise was complete, and Nobuo Fujita was ready to exploit it. The planning for the bombing mission was meticulous, detailed, and left nothing to chance. Intelligence officers in Tokyo had carefully selected the target area based on several critical factors. The region around Brookings, Oregon, and the nearby Siskiyou National Forest offered ideal conditions for what the Japanese hoped to achieve. The forest was dense with old-growth timber, Douglas fir, spruce, and pine, trees that had been growing for centuries, accumulating massive amounts of combustible material. The area was relatively dry in late summer and early September, with low humidity and little recent rainfall. A single spark under the right conditions could ignite a fire that would spread rapidly through the underbrush and climb into the tree canopy, creating an inferno that would be nearly impossible to control. The Japanese planners estimated that if they could start a major forest fire in this region, it would consume hundreds of thousands of acres, threaten nearby towns, and require massive resources to combat. Firefighters, equipment, troops, and aircraft would need to be diverted from the war effort to battle the blaze. The economic impact would be significant. Timber was a critical resource for the American war effort, used in construction, shipbuilding, and countless other applications. But more importantly, the psychological impact would be devastating. A major fire caused by Japanese bombs would shatter the American sense of security, demonstrate that the U.S. mainland was vulnerable, and potentially trigger panic along the entire West Coast. That was the real goal. Terror, uncertainty, and the diversion of American military resources away from the Pacific theater. The flight plan was relatively straightforward, but required precise execution. The I-25 would surface approximately 25 miles off the Oregon coast, far enough offshore to avoid visual detection from coastal lookouts, but close enough to minimize the Glen's flight time and fuel consumption. The submarine would surface in the pre-dawn darkness, giving the deck crew time to assemble the aircraft while visibility was still poor. Launch would occur at approximately 6 a.m., just as the first gray light of dawn began to illuminate the eastern sky. This timing was critical, too early, and Fujita would be unable to navigate or locate his target in the darkness. Too late, and the submarine would be visible on the surface to American patrol aircraft. And Fujita's approach to the coast would be more easily detected. The flight path would take Fujita directly east toward the coastline, flying at low altitude between 100 and 200 meters to stay beneath American radar coverage, which was limited and unreliable at the time. He would cross the shoreline somewhere between the towns of Brookings and Gold Beach, then follow the terrain eastward toward the interior, using landmarks to navigate. The primary target area was a dense section of forest near Mount Emily, a rounded 100-meter peak in the Siskiyou National Forest. The area was remote, heavily forested, and far from any major firefighting resources. If fires started there, they would have time to grow before firefighters could reach them. Fujita would approach the target area from the west, descend to approximately 150 meters altitude, and make a single bombing run. He would release both 76-kilogram incendiary bombs in quick succession, spacing them to maximize the chances of starting multiple separate fires that could merge into a larger conflagration. Immediately after bomb release, he would turn west and descend to low altitude, heading back toward the coast as quickly as possible. The entire mission, from launch to recovery, was expected to take approximately 90 minutes, well within the Glen's fuel endurance. The 2 incendiary bombs were carefully prepared and loaded aboard the submarine. Each bomb was a cylindrical device approximately 50 centimeters long and 20 centimeters in diameter. The bomb casing was made of thin sheet metal designed to rupture on impact. Inside was a mixture of thermite, aluminum powder, and iron oxide, combined with magnesium particles. When detonated, the thermite would ignite and burn at temperatures exceeding 2,200 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt steel, and certainly hot enough to ignite wood, even slightly damp wood. The magnesium would burn with intense white flames, helping to spread the fire. The bombs were equipped with simple impact fuses. When the bomb struck the ground or a tree, the fuse would trigger, igniting the incendiary mixture. There was no timer, no complicated mechanism. It was a simple, reliable design intended to maximize the chances of starting a fire. Fujita and Okuda spent the final days before the mission reviewing every detail. They studied detailed maps of the Oregon coastline, memorizing landmarks, prominent headlands, river mouths, distinctive mountain peaks that would help them navigate. They reviewed the flight plan repeatedly, discussing contingencies and backup plans. What if the weather was bad? What if they encountered American patrol aircraft? What if the submarine was detected and had to dive? They inspected the Glen multiple times, checking every control surface, every bolt, every wire connection. They test ran the engine, listening carefully for any irregularity. They checked the bomb racks, ensuring the release mechanism functioned smoothly. They verified that their sidearms were loaded and functional, though both men knew that if they were forced down over American territory, pistols would be of limited use against an aroused population and military forces. Fujita also took time to write a letter to his wife, a letter that would only be delivered if he did not return. In it, he expressed his love for his family, his hope that they would understand he had done his duty, and his belief that Japan's cause was just. It was a letter that thousands of Japanese servicemen wrote before dangerous missions, a final message in case the worst happened. On the night of September 8, 1942, the I-25 crept close to the Oregon coast, traveling submerged. Captain Tagami raised the periscope periodically, scanning the shoreline, confirming their position against the charts. The coast was dark, the blackout was in effect, and no lights were visible. The sea was relatively calm, with moderate swells. Weather conditions were acceptable for the mission. At 4 a.m. on September 9th, Tagami gave the order to surface. The submarine rose slowly, breaking the surface with barely a ripple. The conning tower hatch opened, and the deck crew emerged quickly, moving in near-total darkness, illuminated only by shielded red flashlights. They opened the aircraft hangar and began the assembly process they had practiced countless times. Wings were unfolded and locked into place with securing pins. Floats were attached to the fuselage, and the attachment points double-checked. The propeller was mounted onto the engine shaft. Fuel tanks were topped off. The 2 incendiary bombs were carefully secured to the underwing racks. Within 20 minutes, the Glen was ready. Fujita and Okuda emerged from the submarine, dressed in flight suits, leather jackets, and goggles. They carried pistols in holsters, maps in waterproof cases, and a compass. They carried no parachutes. If the aircraft went down, they would go down with it. Parachutes were simply too bulky for the cramped cockpit and would have been of little use over the ocean or in dense forest. They climbed into the cockpit. Fujita settled into the pilot's seat on the left, Okuda into the observer's position on the right. They performed a final instrument check. Everything was functioning normally. The deck crew made final adjustments to the catapult, checking the air pressure and ensuring the release mechanism was ready. Captain Tagami climbed onto the deck, standing near the conning tower, his face barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom. At exactly 6 a.m., as the eastern sky began to lighten from black to gray, Fujita started the engine. The 9-cylinder radial roared to life and the propeller spun into an invisible blur. The engine note was steady, powerful, reassuring. Tagami raised his right hand, held it aloft for a moment, then dropped it sharply. The catapult fired with explosive force. Compressed air drove the piston forward, and the Glen shot along the 25-meter rail, accelerating from 0 to flying speed in less than 2 seconds. The aircraft lifted off the end of the catapult, climbed away from the waves, and banked slightly to the east. Below, the I-25 immediately began its crash dive. Water flooded into the ballast tanks. The deck crew scrambled down the hatches. Within 90 seconds, the submarine had disappeared beneath the surface, leaving no trace except fading ripples on the dark Pacific water. Nobuo Fujita was alone in the sky, heading toward the coast of the United States. The mission had begun. The first moments after a catapult launch were always the most critical and the most dangerous. The violent acceleration put tremendous stress on the aircraft's lightweight frame. If any component was improperly secured, if any bolt was loose, if any structural element was weakened, the catapult launch could tear the aircraft apart. Pilots had to react instantly to any problem because there was no room for error and no time for second thoughts. If the engine failed during or immediately after launch, the aircraft would crash into the ocean within seconds, and the pilot would have virtually no chance of survival. But Fujita was a veteran of dozens of catapult launches. His hands moved automatically across the controls, his eyes scanning the instrument panel with practiced efficiency. As the Glen climbed away from the surface, he checked engine temperature, oil pressure, fuel flow, cylinder head temperature, and airspeed. Every gauge showed normal readings. The engine's steady roar was music to his ears, the sound of a machine functioning exactly as it should. Beside him, Petty Officer Okuda adjusted the compass heading and checked their position against the navigation chart spread across his lap. They were flying almost due east, directly toward the Oregon coastline, at an altitude of approximately 200 meters. Low enough to stay beneath the effective range of American coastal radar, but high enough to clear the coastal hills and avoid the worst of any turbulence from the ocean's surface. The morning was gray and overcast, exactly as the weather forecasters aboard the I-25 had predicted. Thick clouds hung low over the ocean, and visibility was poor, perhaps 2 to 3 kilometers at best. But that worked entirely in their favor. Any American lookout scanning the horizon from a coastal tower would see nothing but fog, mist, and gray clouds. The sound of the Glenn's engine would be muffled by wind, and the constant crash of surf against the rocky shoreline. Fujita settled the aircraft into a steady cruising speed of approximately 150 kilometers per hour. At that pace, the flight from their launch point to the coastline would take roughly 10 minutes, and the flight to the target area another 30 to 40 minutes. He had sufficient fuel for approximately 3 hours of flight time, giving him a comfortable margin for the mission and return to the submarine. The ocean below was dark, restless, and unwelcoming. White-capped swells rolled endlessly toward the shore. Fujita had flown over these waters many times during the war, reconnaissance missions over Allied harbors in Australia and New Zealand, but never this close to the American mainland. It felt surreal, almost dreamlike, that he was about to drop bombs on the United States of America, a nation that seemed so distant, so powerful, so untouchable. He thought briefly of his family back in Japan. His wife, who had waved goodbye to him so many times, never knowing if she would see him again. His children, who were too young to understand the war but who would grow up in whatever world this conflict created. Would they be proud of what he was doing today? Or would they mourn the path he had chosen? He pushed the thoughts firmly aside. A pilot could not afford distraction. Focus meant survival. Emotion was a luxury that combat aviators could not indulge. As the minutes passed, the coastline began to emerge gradually from the mist and fog. Dark cliffs appeared first, barely visible against the gray morning. Then rocky beaches, pounded by white surf, and beyond them rising into the low-hanging clouds. The dense green expanse of the forest, an ocean of trees stretching as far as he could see. The Siskiyou National Forest was vast, covering hundreds of square kilometers of mountainous terrain. From the air, it looked like an unbroken carpet of green, punctuated by steep ridges, narrow valleys, and occasional clearings. The trees were massive, old-growth Douglas fir, some of them over 60 meters tall and hundreds of years old. These were the same forests that supplied timber for American shipbuilding, construction, and war industries. Fujita climbed slightly as he crossed the shoreline, gaining altitude to clear the coastal hills. He scanned the sky constantly, watching for American patrol planes, but saw nothing. The sky was empty, silent except for the steady drone of his own engine. Below, the landscape was equally devoid of activity. No vehicles on the few visible roads. No smoke from chimneys. No sign of human presence. The forest seemed almost primeval, untouched, as if no one lived here at all. But Fujita knew that was an illusion. This was American territory, and somewhere down there were people, families in small towns, forestry workers, perhaps military personnel. His bombs would put them at risk. That knowledge sat uneasily in his mind, but orders were orders. He was a soldier. He had a mission. Personal feelings were irrelevant. He banked slightly to the northeast, following the terrain, using the landscape features to navigate. Okuda compared what they saw below with the detailed maps, occasionally tapping Fujita's shoulder and pointing to confirm landmarks. There, that was the Chetco River. And there, that rounded peak rising above the surrounding ridges, that was Mount Emily. That was their target. The forests around Mount Emily were particularly dense. A thick growth of old timber interspersed with undergrowth, fallen logs, and accumulated forest debris. Perfect fuel for a major fire.
Japanese intelligence had studied this area carefully, analyzing photographs, weather patterns, and vegetation density.
They had concluded that this was the most promising location for starting a fire that would spread rapidly and prove difficult to control. Fujita descended slightly, dropping to approximately 150 meters above the treetops. At this altitude, he could see individual trees, could see the texture of the forest canopy, could identify the patches where the growth was thickest. The visibility had improved slightly as the sun climbed higher, though the sky remained overcast and the light was flat and gray. His hand moved to the bomb release lever mounted on the control panel. It was a simple mechanical device. Pull the lever, and both bombs would drop simultaneously from their underwing racks. No complicated bomb sight, no sophisticated aiming mechanism. Fujita would rely on his experience, his judgment of speed and altitude, and a bit of luck. He checked the altimeter, 150 meters. Airspeed 155 kilometers per hour. The aircraft was stable, flying smoothly. The target area was directly ahead, a dense patch of forest on the eastern slope of Mount Emily, far from any roads or settlements. Okuda tapped his shoulder twice. The signal. Ready. Fujita took a breath, steadied his hand on the control stick, and made one final adjustment to his heading. The Glen flew straight and level, the engine humming steadily. At exactly 7:05 a.m. on September 9, 1942, he pulled the bomb release lever. Both incendiary bombs dropped away from the underwing racks, tumbling through the air, spinning as they fell toward the forest below. For 3 seconds, they fell silently through the morning air. Then they vanished into the trees. Fujita immediately banked hard to the left, turning back toward the coast, opening the throttle to maximum power. He did not wait to observe the results. Time to get out. Time to survive. The 2 incendiary bombs struck the forest floor almost simultaneously, penetrating through the canopy and impacting among fallen logs, undergrowth, and accumulated forest debris. The impact fuses triggered instantly. The thin metal casings ruptured, releasing the thermite and magnesium mixture inside. The thermite ignited immediately, reaching temperatures in excess of 2,200 degrees Celsius, hot enough to burn through steel, certainly hot enough to ignite any combustible material within reach. The magnesium particles ignited with intense white flames, creating additional heat and spreading the fire outward from the impact points. Within seconds, small fires began to spread through the undergrowth. Dry leaves caught fire, small branches ignited, fallen logs began to smolder and then burn. Flames leapt from the ground into low-hanging branches, then climbed higher into the tree canopy. From the cockpit of the Glen, now several kilometers away and descending toward the coast, Fujita glanced back over his shoulder. He saw what he had hoped to see, thin columns of gray-white smoke rising from the forest, twisting upward through the trees. The bombs had detonated, fires had started. The mission, from a technical standpoint, was a success. He turned his attention forward, focused on navigation and survival. The flight back to the submarine would take approximately 40 minutes. He needed to stay low, avoid detection, and locate the I-25 at the prearranged rendezvous point. But as he flew west toward the ocean, he felt a sense of satisfaction. He had accomplished what no other pilot in history had done. He had bombed the continental United States. Behind him, on the ground, the fires were spreading, but not in the way Japan had hoped. The problem was moisture. September in Oregon is a transitional month when late summer begins to shift toward autumn. Morning dew is heavy, soaking the forest floor. The air holds moisture from the Pacific, creating high humidity levels. And while the region had experienced a relatively dry summer, it had not been dry enough to turn the forest into the tinderbox that Japanese planners had anticipated. Yes, the thermite bombs had started fires. But the fires were struggling to spread beyond the immediate impact zones. The damp forest floor resisted ignition. Wet moss and ferns smoldered but did not catch fire. Green foliage in the lower branches would not burn. The fires that did start were small, contained, burning in isolated patches rather than merging into the massive conflagration Japan had hoped for. But smoke was rising, and that smoke was visible. Several kilometers to the west, at a U.S. Forest Service fire lookout tower designated as Lookout Post 7, Howard Raz Gardner was beginning his morning shift. Gardner was a 32-year-old forestry worker who had been assigned to lookout duty as part of the wartime civil defense effort. Every fire lookout in the Pacific Northwest had been instructed to remain especially vigilant since Pearl Harbor, watching not just for forest fires but for any sign of enemy activity, flares, signals, suspicious aircraft, anything unusual. Gardner had been at his post since dawn, scanning the horizon with binoculars, sipping coffee from a thermos, and filling out the routine observation log. It had been a quiet morning, foggy, nothing to report. Then he heard something, a faint, distant sound. A buzzing, mechanical sound that seemed out of place in the wilderness. He paused, tilting his head, listening intently. The sound grew slightly louder, then began to fade. An airplane? Out here? Gardner raised his binoculars and scanned the eastern sky. For several seconds, he saw nothing but clouds and fog. Then, there, a small silhouette, barely visible against the overcast sky. It was distant, perhaps 5 or 6 kilometers away, and it was moving fast, heading west. Gardner focused the binoculars, trying to identify the aircraft. It looked small, very small, and it appeared to have floats, a seaplane. But that made no sense. There were no lakes in that area large enough for a seaplane to land on. The nearest suitable body of water was the ocean, dozens of kilometers to the west. What was a seaplane doing flying low over the interior forests? And then he saw the smoke, 2 separate columns of smoke rising from the forest to the northeast. Thin columns, but definitely smoke, right in the area where the aircraft had been. Gardner's stomach tightened. He grabbed the hand-crank field telephone that connected the lookout tower to the nearest ranger station and began cranking frantically. A voice answered. "Ranger Station 4, go ahead." "This is Lookout Post 7, Gardner speaking," he said quickly. "I've got smoke. 2 separate sources, maybe 2 kilometers apart, northeast of Mount Emily in the Siskiyou. And I just saw an aircraft, looked like a seaplane, flying low over the area right before the smoke appeared." There was a pause on the other end. "A seaplane? Are you sure, Raz?" "I know what I saw," Gardner insisted. "Small aircraft, single engine, looked like it had floats. And there's definitely smoke rising from the forest. You need to get a crew out there." The ranger on duty knew Gardner was reliable. "Okay, we're mobilizing a fire crew now. Keep watching and let us know if the smoke gets worse or if you see anything else." "Will do," Gardner said, and hung up the phone. He raised his binoculars again, studying the smoke columns. They were rising steadily but didn't seem to be growing significantly larger. That was good. It meant the fires were still small and might be controllable. But the appearance of that aircraft bothered him deeply. Something was wrong. Something didn't add up. At the ranger station, the duty officer immediately called in a wildfire response team. Within 30 minutes, a crew of 6 firefighters was hiking toward the smoke location, carrying shovels, axes, buckets, and emergency fire shelters. The terrain was rough, and the hike took nearly an hour. They followed the smoke columns, pushing through dense undergrowth, scrambling over fallen logs, navigating steep slopes. When they finally reached the first fire site, they found something unexpected. The fire was small, no larger than a typical campfire, and was already beginning to die down on its own. The flames had consumed the immediate area of dry debris, but had failed to spread into the surrounding damp vegetation. The firefighters quickly extinguished what remained, using shovels to throw dirt on the flames and buckets to douse the hot spots with water from a nearby creek. But then they noticed something strange scattered around the burn site. Fragments of metal, pieces of twisted, charred metal that looked like parts of a cylindrical container, and traces of a white, powdery residue that looked like burned magnesium. The crew chief picked up one of the metal fragments, examining it closely. This was not natural. This was not lightning. This was not an accidental fire caused by a campfire or a cigarette. This was a bomb. "Everyone stop," he said quietly. "Don't touch anything else. We need to report this immediately." They moved to the second fire site, about 2 kilometers away, and found the same thing. A small fire already dying out, and more metal fragments. The crew chief used a portable radio to contact the ranger station. "We've extinguished both fires," he reported. "Minimal damage, but you need to get law enforcement out here immediately. These fires weren't natural. We found bomb fragments at both sites." The message went up the chain of command rapidly, from the ranger station to the regional forestry office. From there to the county sheriff. from the sheriff to the Oregon State Police, from the state police to the FBI field office in Portland, and from the FBI to the War Department in Washington, D.C. by evening. Military intelligence officers and FBI agents were on the scene, carefully collecting the bomb fragments and photographing the impact sites. Explosive experts examined the residue and quickly identified it as thermite, a military incendiary mixture used in bombs and grenades. The conclusion was inescapable. Japanese incendiary bombs had been dropped on American soil, which meant a Japanese aircraft had penetrated American airspace, flown over Oregon, and conducted a bombing attack. The realization sent shockwaves through the military command structure. How had a Japanese plane reached Oregon? Where had it come from? Was this the beginning of a larger attack? Were more raids planned? Intelligence analysts worked through the night examining every possibility. Could the aircraft have come from an aircraft carrier? No. The nearest known Japanese carrier group was thousands of kilometers away in the Western Pacific, and carrier-based aircraft didn't have the range to reach Oregon and return. Could the plane have come from a secret airfield in Canada or Mexico? Highly unlikely. Such a base would be impossible to hide. Could it have been launched from a submarine? That last possibility seemed the most plausible, though even that seemed almost incredible. Intelligence reports indicated that Japan had experimented with submarine-launched aircraft, but no one had imagined they would use them to attack the American mainland. Reconnaissance flights were launched immediately along the coast, searching for enemy submarines or any other signs of Japanese naval activity. Coastal radar stations were put on maximum alert. Fighter squadrons at airfields in Oregon, Washington, and California were ordered to increase patrols. Anti-submarine warfare units were mobilized, but the I-25 was long gone. By the time American forces began their search, the submarine was already 200 kilometers offshore, running submerged, heading south along the coast. Captain Tagami had successfully recovered Fujita and the Glen, stowed the aircraft back in its hangar, and disappeared into the vastness of the Pacific. 3 weeks passed. September turned toward October. The forests of Oregon grew damper as autumn rains began to arrive with increasing frequency. The incident on Mount Emily was buried in classified files, known only to a small number of military and intelligence personnel who had been sworn to secrecy. But Nobuo Fujita was not finished with Oregon. The I-25 had remained in the area, conducting submarine warfare operations against Allied shipping. On September 10th, the day after the first bombing raid, the submarine had moved south along the coast. Over the following weeks, it attacked several merchant vessels, sinking 2 ships and damaging others with torpedo attacks. But Tokyo wanted another bombing mission. The first raid had proven that submarine-launched aircraft could reach the American mainland and drop bombs without being intercepted. Intelligence reports, based on intercepted American radio communications and other sources, suggested that the Americans had discovered the bombs but were keeping the incident secret. That meant the psychological impact had been limited. Japan decided to try again. Orders came through to Captain Tagami. Conduct a second bombing raid on the Oregon forests. This time, strike a different location to demonstrate that the first attack was not a fluke and to show that Japan could hit multiple targets along the American coast. On the morning of September 29, 1942, the I-25 once again surfaced approximately 25 miles off the Oregon coast. The deck crew emerged and began the now familiar process of assembling the Glen. Wings were unfolded. Floats were attached. The engine was fueled. 2 more incendiary bombs, identical to those used in the first raid, were loaded onto the underwing racks. Fujita and Okuda prepared for the mission just as they had 3 weeks earlier. Same pre-flight checks, same weapons, same aircraft. But this time, the conditions were noticeably different. The weather had deteriorated. Heavy clouds hung low over the coastline, and a steady drizzle was falling. Visibility was worse than it had been during the first mission. The wind was stronger, gusting from the southwest, creating turbulence that would make flying more challenging. The sea state was rougher, with larger swells that made the submarine's surface operations more precarious. But Tagami decided the mission could proceed. The poor weather would actually provide better cover for the submarine and the aircraft. American patrol planes would be less likely to be flying in such conditions. And while the visibility was poor, It was still sufficient for Fujita to navigate and locate a target. At approximately 5:45 a.m., the catapult fired, and the Glen launched into the gray morning sky. The aircraft climbed away from the submarine, which immediately crash-dived and disappeared beneath the waves. Fujita banked eastward and began the flight toward the coast. The flying conditions were significantly worse than during the first mission. Turbulence buffeted the lightweight aircraft, requiring constant attention to maintain heading and altitude. Rain drummed against the windscreen and wings. Visibility was reduced to perhaps 2 kilometers, and even that came and went as patches of heavier rain swept across the landscape. Navigation was more difficult. Landmarks were harder to identify through the rain and mist. Okuda had to work harder to match what they could see with the features on their maps. But both men were experienced, skilled aviators. They pressed on. The target for this second mission was a different area of forest, deeper in the mountains and farther from the first attack site. Intelligence planners in Tokyo wanted to spread the attacks across a wider area to create the impression that Japan could strike anywhere along the coast. The new target was near Wheeler Ridge, an area of particularly dense old-growth timber. Fujita crossed the coastline and flew inland, following valleys and ridgelines, staying low to avoid detection. The forest below looked even more impenetrable than during the first mission, an unbroken expanse of dark green, soaked by rain, shrouded in mist. After approximately 30 minutes of flying inland, Okuda identified the target area. Fujita descended to bombing altitude about 150 meters and lined up his approach. The aircraft bounced and shuddered in the turbulence, making it difficult to maintain a steady course, but Fujita compensated with smooth, precise control inputs. At approximately 7:15 a.m., he released both bombs. The incendiary devices tumbled away, spinning through the rain, and disappeared into the forest below. Fujita immediately turned west, pushed the throttle forward, and began the flight back to the rendezvous point. Behind him, the bombs detonated on impact, just as they had 3 weeks earlier. The thermite ignited. The magnesium burned with white-hot intensity. Flames erupted through the undergrowth, but this time the conditions were even less favorable for fire. The rain-soaked forest simply would not burn. The flames sputtered and smoked, but struggled to spread beyond the immediate impact zones. Wet vegetation refused to ignite. Water dripped constantly from the canopy, dousing embers before they could develop into sustained fires. Within an hour, the fires had largely extinguished themselves without any human intervention. A few local residents in the area, hikers and forestry workers, reported hearing what sounded like an aircraft engine in the distance, and some saw brief flashes of light in the forest. But by the time anyone investigated the area, there was almost nothing to find. Just charred patches of ground, scattered bomb fragments, and the smell of smoke. Once again, the U.S. government classified the incident immediately. Military personnel collected the bomb fragments. Witnesses were questioned and instructed not to discuss what they had seen. The official explanation was that lightning had caused small fires that had extinguished themselves naturally. But privately, military and intelligence officials were deeply concerned. This was the second attack in 3 weeks. Same location, the Oregon coast. Same method, incendiary bombs. Same mysterious aircraft that appeared from nowhere and vanished without being detected or intercepted. The pattern was clear. Japan had developed a method to attack the American mainland, and they were using it. If they could do it twice, they could do it again. And next time, the results might be more damaging. The response was swift and comprehensive. The War Department allocated significant resources to improve coastal defense. Radar coverage was expanded along the entire West Coast, with new stations installed to fill gaps in coverage. More fighter squadrons were deployed to airfields in Washington, Oregon, and California, with orders to maintain standing patrols and scramble capability. Navy patrol aircraft increased their anti-submarine sweeps, using visual search, radar, and magnetic anomaly detection equipment. The Army established a new network of observation posts along the coast, staffed by trained personnel equipped with aircraft recognition guides, binoculars, and direct communication links to military command centers. Civilian spotters were recruited and trained to report any unusual activity. Anti-submarine warfare efforts were intensified. Destroyers and submarine chasers conducted aggressive patrols. New detection technologies were rushed into deployment. Depth charge tactics were refined. In a sense, Japan's strategy had worked. The raids forced the United States to divert significant resources, personnel, equipment, aircraft, ships, to homeland defense. Troops and materials that might have been sent to the Pacific Theater to support offensive operations were instead deployed along the West Coast to defend against potential future attacks. But the psychological impact was muted because the American public never knew about the attacks. The government's decision to classify both incidents meant that the panic Japan had hoped to inspire never materialized. Ordinary Americans went about their daily lives, unaware that enemy bombs had twice fallen on American soil. For Fujita, the second raid marked the end of his bombing missions over the United States. The I-25 moved on to other operations, and Fujita returned to his primary role as a reconnaissance pilot. He never flew over Oregon again, but the submarine's war was far from over. And for many of the men aboard the I-25, that war would soon come to a tragic end. After completing the second bombing raid on Oregon, submarine I-25 continued its aggressive patrol of the Pacific coast of North America, hunting for targets of opportunity and gathering intelligence on American naval movements. On October 5, 1942, the I-25 struck again, but this time, the target was not a forest but Allied shipping. The submarine detected and attacked the American merchant ship SS Camden, a 7,176-ton cargo vessel traveling from San Francisco to Australia carrying military supplies. The I-25 fired a single torpedo that struck the Camden amidships, causing catastrophic damage. The ship sank within minutes. Of the 36 crew members aboard, only 12 survived, rescued after spending hours in the cold Pacific water. The same day, the I-25 attacked another American merchant vessel, the SS Larry Doheny, a 5,172-ton tanker. This ship was also hit by a torpedo and sank rapidly. The attacks demonstrated that the I-25 was not just a platform for unusual bombing missions. It was a highly effective attack submarine capable of inflicting serious damage on Allied shipping. On October 11th, the I-25 surfaced off the coast of Vancouver Island and encountered a Soviet submarine, the L-16, which was sailing from the Soviet Union to the United States for repairs. Despite the fact that Japan and the Soviet Union were not officially at war with each other at that time, the I-25 engaged the Soviet vessel with deck gunfire. The L-16 crash-dived and escaped without serious damage, but the encounter demonstrated Captain Tagami's aggressive tactics and the I-25's willingness to engage any target that presented itself. Throughout October and into November 1942, the I-25 remained a persistent threat off the North American coast. American anti-submarine forces searched for the submarine, but the Pacific was vast, and submarine detection technology in 1942 was still primitive. The I-25 was skilled at evading detection, using its speed, deep-diving capability, and the experience of its crew to slip away whenever American forces approached. But by late 1942, the submarine needed to return to Japan for resupply, maintenance, and crew rest. The months-long patrol had been grueling. Food supplies were depleted. Fuel was running low. Mechanical systems needed repair. The crew was exhausted. In November 1942, the I-25 began the long voyage back across the Pacific to its home base. Fujita and Okuda were aboard for the return journey, but they knew their role in the Oregon bombing missions was complete. The missions had been technically successful. They had proven that submarine-launched aircraft could reach and bomb the American mainland, but the strategic impact had been limited because the fires had failed to spread as hoped, and the American government had kept the attacks secret. When the I-25 reached Japan in early December 1942, Fujita and Okuda were reassigned. Fujita was transferred to a naval training unit, where he would spend the remainder of the war instructing new pilots in reconnaissance techniques. Okuda received a similar assignment. Their days of flying combat missions were over, but the I-25 returned to active duty after a refit and resupply period. In early 1943, under a new commanding officer, Captain Tagami had been reassigned to other duties. The submarine sailed back into the war zone, this time operating in the South Pacific, where fierce battles were raging between Japanese and Allied forces for control of the Solomon Islands. The submarine conducted several patrols in the region, attacking Allied shipping and gathering intelligence. But American anti-submarine capabilities had improved dramatically since 1942. Radar technology had advanced. Sonar systems were more effective. Aircraft were equipped with better detection equipment. And American forces had developed more aggressive tactics for hunting and killing submarines. On August 25, 1943, the I-25's luck ran out. The submarine was operating near the island of Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides when it was detected by two U.S. Navy destroyers, USS Patterson, DD-392, and USS Bagley, DD-386. The destroyers had been conducting an anti-submarine sweep when their sonar operators picked up a contact, a submarine running submerged, trying to evade detection. The destroyers immediately moved to attack positions and began dropping depth charges, large cylindrical bombs filled with explosives, designed to sink and detonate at a preset depth, creating shockwaves that could crush a submarine's hull. The first pattern of depth charges exploded around the I-25, rocking the submarine violently. The crew fought to control the vessel, but the damage was severe. Hydraulic systems failed, ballast tanks ruptured, electrical systems shorted out. The submarine began to sink, unable to maintain depth control. The destroyers pressed their attack, dropping more depth charges. The explosions were devastating. The I-25's hull buckled under the pressure. Water flooded through breached seals and torn bulkheads. Men screamed in the darkness as compartments flooded. Emergency lighting failed. Captain Tagami, who had been reassigned to another submarine, was not aboard, but the current commanding officer ordered the crew to abandon ship, hoping some men might escape. But at depth, with the submarine sinking and under attack, escape was virtually impossible. The I-25 sank rapidly, taking all 94 crew members to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. There were no survivors. The submarine that had struck the American mainland, that had sunk Allied ships and conducted daring reconnaissance missions across thousands of miles of ocean, was now a tomb lying in the deep water off Espiritu Santo. When news of the I-25's sinking eventually reached Japan, Nobuo Fujita felt the loss deeply. He had served aboard that submarine for months. He had flown from its deck. He knew many of the crew members personally. Petty Officer Shoji Okuda, his observer and friend, had been transferred to another unit and survived, but so many others were gone. Fujita mourned quietly. The Japanese military did not encourage open displays of emotion, and warriors were expected to accept death stoically. But in private moments, Fujita thought about the men who had helped him accomplish his historic mission, the deck crews who had assembled his aircraft in darkness, the engineers who had maintained the Glen, the officers who had planned the missions. They were gone, swallowed by the Pacific that had been their hunting ground. As 1943 turned to 1944, and 1944 turned to 1945, Japan's military situation grew increasingly desperate. Allied forces advanced across the Pacific, island by island, pushing Japanese forces back toward the home islands. Air raids on Japanese cities intensified. Resources dwindled. Victory seemed impossible, yet the military fought on. Fujita continued his duties as an instructor, training new reconnaissance pilots in techniques he had developed over years of combat flying. But fuel shortages and aircraft losses meant that training sorties became less frequent. By mid-1945, Japan's once mighty naval air force had been reduced to a shadow of its former strength. In August 1945, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito made a radio broadcast announcing Japan's surrender. The war was over. Japan had lost. Fujita listened to the emperor's broadcast in stunned silence, along with millions of his countrymen. The voice they heard, the first time most Japanese people had ever heard their emperor speak, was thin, formal, and filled with tragic dignity. The war that had consumed so many lives, destroyed so many cities, and shattered so many families was finally over. Nobuo Fujita removed his naval uniform, folded it carefully, and placed it away. He was no longer a pilot, no longer a warrior. He was simply a man trying to survive in a devastated nation, uncertain what the future held. The mission over Oregon seemed like a lifetime ago, a memory from another world. But that mission, and what came after, would eventually bring him back to the place he had once tried to burn. And it would transform him in ways he could never have imagined. 20 years passed. Japan rebuilt. America rebuilt. The wounds of war began, slowly and imperfectly, to heal. Japan transformed from a defeated, occupied nation into an economic powerhouse. With American aid through the Marshall Plan equivalent for Asia, Japanese industry revived. Democracy took root. The country that had waged aggressive war across the Pacific became a peaceful, prosperous ally of the United States. But the memories remained, memories of war, loss, and the terrible choices people had made in the name of duty and nation. Nobuo Fujita had returned to civilian life in 1945, uncertain and adrift. He found work in various businesses, sales, small manufacturing ventures, whatever would support his family. He married, had children, and tried to build a normal life. He rarely spoke of the war. When people asked what he had done during those years, he answered briefly and changed the subject. The mission over Oregon was a buried memory, locked away in classified files on both sides of the Pacific. In 1962, something extraordinary happened that would change the rest of Fujita's life. The town of Brookings, Oregon, population approximately 3,000, was organizing a community festival celebrating the region's history, culture, and the natural beauty of the Oregon coast. The festival committee wanted to include something related to World War II, to honor local veterans and acknowledge the community's small role in that global conflict. Someone on the committee, accounts vary as to exactly who, discovered declassified military reports about the Japanese bombing raids on the forest near Mount Emily. The reports had been kept secret for years, but were finally released in the late 1950s as part of a general declassification of wartime documents. The committee members were astonished. Japanese bombs had fallen on their forests. An enemy aircraft had flown over their town. Why had no one ever told them? As they researched further, they discovered more details. The pilot's name, Nobuo Fujita. The submarine, I-25. The dates, September 9th and September 29th, 1942. The minimal damage caused by the bombs, thanks to damp weather conditions. And then someone, Evelyn Pattison, a member of the Brookings Harbor Chamber of Commerce, had a radical idea. What if they invited Fujita to the festival? What if they reached out to the man who had once tried to burn their forests and invited him to return? Not as an enemy, but as a guest. As a gesture of reconciliation and peace? It was an extraordinary proposal that sparked intense debate in the community. The war had ended less than 2 decades earlier. The pain was still fresh. Many families in Brookings had lost sons, brothers, or fathers in the Pacific. Veterans who had fought against Japanese forces still lived in the town. Would they accept a former Japanese pilot in their community? Would they see it as an insult to the memory of those who had died? There were heated discussions at town hall meetings. Some residents were outraged by the idea. They argued that inviting Fujita would be disrespectful to American veterans, that it would trivialize the sacrifices made during the war, that some wounds should not be reopened, but others saw it differently. They argued that reconciliation was important, that holding on to hatred served no purpose, that the war was over, and it was time to build bridges instead of maintaining walls. They pointed to the fact that Fujita's bombs had caused no casualties and minimal damage. They argued that reaching out to a former enemy took courage and demonstrated American values of forgiveness and generosity. After weeks of debate, those who favored reconciliation prevailed. The invitation was approved and sent to Japan through official channels, from the Brookings Chamber of Commerce to the U.S. State Department to the Japanese Foreign Ministry to Nobuo Fujita's home. When Fujita received the letter, he was stunned and terrified. He was now 51 years old, a businessman living a quiet life in Japan. His pilot days were decades behind him. The war felt like a different lifetime, though its shadows still haunted his dreams. He had nightmares about the men aboard the I-25, his comrades who had died when the submarine was sunk. He wondered about the people in Oregon. Had his bombs killed anyone? Had families suffered because of what he had done? And now those same people were inviting him to visit? Fujita's first instinct was to refuse. He assumed it must be a trap, or perhaps an opportunity for revenge. Perhaps Americans wanted to put him on trial, or publicly humiliate him, or worse. His family begged him not to go. His wife was terrified that he would be arrested or attacked. His children worried that he was walking into danger. But Fujita had lived his entire life by a code inherited from his samurai ancestors: honor, duty, courage, and facing the consequences of one's actions. If the people of Brookings had shown the courage to extend an invitation to a former enemy, he had to show the courage to accept it. To refuse would be cowardice, and whatever else he might be, Nobuo Fujita was not a coward, he wrote back, accepting the invitation. He would come to Brookings. In October 1962, Fujita boarded a commercial airliner, his first return to the United States since the war. During the long flight across the Pacific, his emotions churned. Anxiety, fear, guilt, curiosity. What would he find in Brookings? Anger, hatred, forgiveness? He had no idea. When the plane landed in Oregon and he made his way to Brookings, he was met at the edge of town by local officials, reporters with cameras and notebooks, and a crowd of curious residents who had come to see the Japanese pilot who had bombed their forest 20 years earlier. Fujita stepped out of the car that had brought him from the airport, wearing a dark suit, his face tense with anxiety. He expected hostility, perhaps even violence. Instead, something unexpected happened. People smiled. They extended their hands. They welcomed him. Evelyn Pattison, one of the primary organizers of the invitation, greeted him warmly, speaking through a translator. "Welcome to Brookings, Mr. Fujita. We're honored that you've come." As Fujita was escorted through the town, he stared out the car window at the peaceful streets, the shops decorated with American flags, the children playing in yards, the normalcy of small-town American life. This was the place he had tried to burn? It seemed so ordinary, so innocent, so far removed from the war and violence that had defined his life 2 decades earlier. Over the next several days, Fujita met with community leaders, local veterans, residents, and school children. He visited the site where his bombs had fallen, now just a quiet patch of forest with young trees growing where the fires had burned. A small commemorative marker had been placed there, noting the historical significance of the location as the only place in the continental United States where enemy bombs had fallen during World War II. The town organized a ceremony at the Brookings Public Library, where hundreds of people gathered to hear Fujita speak. Through a translator, he told his story. He explained the mission, the orders he had followed, the training that had prepared him, the fear he had felt flying into enemy territory. He spoke about the submarine I-25 and the crew members who had perished when it was sunk. And then he did something that many in the audience did not expect. He apologized. His voice breaking with emotion, Fujita said, "I am deeply sorry for what I tried to do. I came here as a soldier following orders. I did not think about the people who lived in this forest, the families who might be hurt, the lives that could be destroyed. I only thought about my duty to my country and my emperor. But now, 20 years later, I understand that war brings suffering to everyone, to both sides. I see the faces of the people whose homes I tried to burn. I see the peaceful life you have built here, and I am filled with shame for what I attempted." He continued, his words translated carefully. "I cannot change the past. I cannot undo what I did. But I can stand before you today and tell you that I was wrong. That following orders does not absolve one of responsibility. That every bomb dropped, every bullet fired, affects real human beings with families and hopes and dreams. I pray that such things never happen again. I pray that my children and your children never know the horror of war." The room was completely silent as the translator finished. Many people in the audience had tears in their eyes. Then, slowly, almost hesitantly, someone began to applaud. Then another person joined, then another. Within seconds, the entire room was applauding, not loudly or triumphantly, but with a quiet, respectful acknowledgement that took courage and moral honesty to do what Fujita had just done. But Fujita was not finished. He reached into a cloth bag he had brought with him and carefully removed something wrapped in silk. He unwrapped it slowly, revealing a sword. It was a katana, a traditional samurai sword with a curved blade, a simple but elegant guard, and a handle wrapped in black silk cord. The blade gleamed even in the library's fluorescent lighting. Through the translator, Fujita explained, This sword has been in my family for more than 400 years. It was carried by my ancestors who served as samurai during Japan's feudal era. It has seen war. It has seen blood. It represents generations of warriors who believed that loyalty and duty were the highest virtues. He paused, looking at the sword, then continued. But I believe that sword has seen enough war. I believe it is time for it to represent something different. I want to give this sword to the people of Brookings to remain here as a symbol, not of war, but of friendship. Not of division, but of reconciliation. Not of the violence of the past, but of the possibility of peace in the future. He approached the mayor of Brookings and bowed deeply, extending the sword with both hands in the traditional Japanese manner. The mayor, a World War II veteran named Doug Henderson, who had fought in the Pacific, accepted the sword with visible emotion. His hands trembled slightly as he took it. "Mr. Fujita," he said, "this is one of the most generous and courageous acts I have ever witnessed in my life. We will treasure this gift. We will display it with honor. And we will remember always what it represents. That even former enemies can become friends if they have the courage to face each other with honesty and compassion." The two men shook hands, and the audience rose to its feet in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. The sword was placed on permanent display in the Brookings Public Library, where it remains to this day, a tangible reminder of reconciliation emerging from conflict. But Fujita's connection to Brookings did not end with that single visit. Over the following decades, he returned to the town multiple times. He developed genuine friendships with residents. He corresponded regularly with families in Brookings. He established a scholarship fund to sponsor Brookings high school students to visit Japan, hoping to build cultural bridges between the two nations. He gave talks at local schools about the importance of peace and understanding between peoples. In 1985, Fujita planted a tree near the bombing site, a Japanese cedar that he brought as a gift from his homeland. The tree was planted in a small ceremony, and Fujita spoke about how it symbolized new growth emerging from old wounds, about how even in a place where he had once tried to bring destruction, life could flourish. In 1992, on the 50th anniversary of the bombing, Fujita returned once more to Brookings, now 81 years old, frail, walking with a cane, but determined to make the journey. The town organized a major commemoration event. Fujita was made an honorary citizen of Brookings in a ceremony that drew people from across Oregon and beyond. Japanese and American flags flew side by side. Veterans from both nations attended, shaking hands, sharing stories. When Fujita spoke at that ceremony, his words were simple but profound. "I came to this place once to bring war and destruction. I have returned many times to bring friendship and peace. This transformation, from enemy to friend, shows me that people can change, that nations can change, that even the bitterest enemies can become friends if they are willing to remember the past without being imprisoned by it. I believe this is the most important lesson of my life." When Nobuo Fujita died on September 30th, 1997, at the age of 85, his family honored a final wish he had expressed. A portion of his ashes was sent to Brookings and scattered in the Siskiyou National Forest near Mount Emily, the same forest he had once tried to burn with incendiary bombs. The pilot who had bombed America now rested in American soil, at peace. The town of Brookings held a memorial service attended by hundreds of people. The Japanese consul general from San Francisco attended. American veterans who had once fought against Japan stood beside Japanese visitors and mourned together. It was an extraordinary moment, a testament to the power of forgiveness, reconciliation, and the human capacity for transformation. Today, visitors to Brookings can see Fujita's samurai sword in its case at the public library, accompanied by plaques explaining its history and significance. They can hike to the bomb site and find the commemorative marker and the Japanese cedar tree Fujita planted. They can read about the scholarships he established. They can learn about a man who began as an enemy and became a friend. The Lookout air raids of September 1942 were, in purely military terms, a failure. The bombs caused minimal damage, a few charred patches of forest floor, some burned undergrowth, nothing that posed any serious threat to American war production or civilian morale. The fires burned themselves out quickly, aided by damp weather conditions. No one was killed. No buildings were destroyed. No strategic military objectives were achieved. Japan had hoped to ignite massive forest fires that would consume thousands of acres, threaten towns, and force the diversion of American troops and resources from the Pacific Front to homeland defense. That did not happen. But in a broader sense, the raids did achieve something significant, just not what Japan had intended. They proved, definitively, that no place on Earth was truly safe during modern warfare. The oceans were not impenetrable barriers. Distance was not an absolute defense. Even the most remote, peaceful corners of a nation could be touched by war. The American mainland, which had never been attacked by a foreign power in the 20th century, was vulnerable. This realization forced the United States to fundamentally rethink homeland defense. The government expanded radar coverage along all American coastlines. More fighter squadrons were stationed at domestic bases. Observation posts were built and staffed. Anti-submarine warfare capabilities were improved. A comprehensive civil defense system was developed. Many of these improvements and systems would remain in place long after World War II ended. They would serve the nation during the Cold War, when the threat of Soviet bombers and missiles required constant vigilance. The concept of homeland defense, of treating American territory as potentially vulnerable to attack, became a permanent feature of American military planning. For Japan, the raids demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of submarine-launched aircraft. Yes, the concept worked technically. Submarines could approach enemy coasts undetected, launch aircraft, conduct missions, recover the planes, and escape. But the strategic value was questionable. The resources required to build, maintain, and operate submarine aircraft carriers could arguably have been better used building more conventional submarines or other weapon systems. After 1942, Japan conducted fewer submarine aircraft operations, focusing instead on more conventional submarine warfare and eventually on kamikaze attacks as the war situation became desperate. The I-25 was one of the last submarines to conduct offensive air operations against American territory. But beyond the military and strategic lessons, the story of Nobuo Fujita and the Lookout air raids offers something deeper and more profound. A lesson about humanity, responsibility, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption. Fujita did not have to return to Brookings in 1962. He could have stayed in Japan, kept his wartime past hidden, and lived quietly. Many former Japanese military personnel did exactly that, retreating into silence, never discussing what they had done during the war, carrying their guilt and shame privately. But Fujita chose differently. He chose to face the people he had once tried to harm. He chose to acknowledge what he had done and to take responsibility for his actions. He chose to apologize, not with empty words or excuses, but with genuine remorse and a commitment to build bridges rather than maintain walls. That took extraordinary courage. It would have been easier to refuse the invitation, to avoid confrontation, to let the past remain buried. But Fujita believed in facing consequences, in accepting responsibility, in making amends where possible. These were the values his samurai ancestors had taught, not just loyalty and duty in war, but honor and integrity in all circumstances. And the people of Brookings made an equally courageous choice. They did not have to invite Fujita. They could have held on to their anger, their fear, their sense of victimhood. They could have maintained that Fujita was an enemy who deserved only condemnation. Many communities would have made that choice, but Brookings chose differently. They chose to extend a hand of friendship to a former enemy. They chose to see Fujita not as a monster or a villain, but as a human being, flawed, conflicted, capable of both harm and growth. They chose reconciliation over resentment, forgiveness over revenge, hope over hatred. This does not mean we should romanticize war or minimize its horrors. World War II killed more than 70 million people. It brought unspeakable suffering to every continent. The atomic bombings, the Holocaust, the fire bombings of cities, the brutal island campaigns in the Pacific, the millions of civilian deaths. These are tragedies that can never be fully understood or adequately mourned, and not all wounds can heal. Not all wrongs can be forgiven. Some actions are so terrible, some suffering so profound, that reconciliation is not possible or appropriate. We must acknowledge that truth, But the story of Fujita and Brookings reminds us that even in the aftermath of terrible violence, reconciliation is sometimes possible. That enemies can become friends. That people can change, grow, and learn from their mistakes. That the courage to forgive is as important, perhaps more important, than the courage to fight. Today, the physical evidence of the Lookout air raids is minimal. The bomb sites are barely visible, just slight depressions in the forest floor, marked by commemorative plaques. The Japanese cedar tree Fujita planted grows peacefully among the Douglas firs. The samurai sword rests in its display case in the library, a reminder of transformation from weapons to symbols of peace. But the lesson endures. History is not just about battles won and lost, about territories conquered and defended, about military strategies and political decisions. History is also about the choices individual human beings make, choices about how to treat enemies, how to respond to harm, how to build a better future from a painful past. Nobuo Fujita made his choice. He chose to return, to apologize, to seek reconciliation. The people of Brookings made their choice. They chose to invite, to forgive, to build friendship from enmity. Together, they showed that even an act of war can end in peace. If people have the courage to face the past honestly, to acknowledge wrongdoing, to extend compassion, and to believe that transformation is possible. The fire that Fujita tried to start in 1942 never really took hold. The damp Oregon forest refused to burn, but the fire of reconciliation that he helped kindle in 1962 still burns brightly today, warming everyone who encounters this remarkable story. From the silence of Oregon's ancient pines to the waves of the Pacific, from the cramped cockpit of a tiny seaplane to the welcoming streets of a small American town, the story reminds us of a simple but profound truth. We can choose what kind of world we build from the ruins of conflict. We can choose whether to perpetuate cycles of revenge or to break them. We can choose whether our legacy will be one of continued hatred or of hard-won peace. Nobuo Fujita and the people of Brookings chose peace. And in doing so, they transformed a forgotten footnote of World War II into one of the war's most inspiring and hopeful stories. You've just heard the complete, detailed account of the only aerial bombing of the continental United States during World War II. The story of Nobuo Fujita, a reconnaissance pilot who followed orders, flew from a submarine, dropped incendiary bombs on the Oregon forest, and then, 2 decades later, returned to the same place to build bridges of friendship and peace. It's a story that remained classified for years. A story that almost no one knows. A story that textbooks skip over because it doesn't fit the conventional narratives we tell about World War II. But it's a story that matters, precisely because it shows us something beyond the usual tales of heroism and sacrifice. It shows us that history is made by human beings, flawed, complicated, capable of both terrible violence and extraordinary compassion. It shows us that enemies are not abstract forces, but people who can change, grow, and seek redemption. It shows us that forgiveness is not weakness, but one of the most difficult and courageous choices human beings can make. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about war, peace, responsibility, and the possibility of reconciliation, then I would be deeply honored if you would subscribe to Wardiere. This channel exists to bring you these forgotten stories, these overlooked moments, these complicated truths that challenge our assumptions and expand our understanding of history. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Because history is not just about memorizing dates and names. It's about understanding the human experiences behind the events, the moral choices people faced, the lessons that echo across decades. And please, share this video with someone who would appreciate it. Share it with a history teacher, a veteran, a student, anyone who believes that the past has wisdom to offer the present. These stories deserve to be told. They deserve to be remembered. And they deserve to reach people who will carry their lessons forward. Leave a comment below and tell me, what did you take away from this story? Did it change how you think about World War II? About enemies and forgiveness? About the long, difficult journey from conflict to peace? I read every single comment, and I genuinely want to hear your thoughts, your questions, your reflections. And if you want to support this channel and help us continue producing these deep, thoroughly researched historical documentaries, consider becoming a patron. Every contribution helps us invest more time in research, better production quality, and bringing you more of these stories that history forgot, but that we desperately need to remember. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about history, not just the grand sweep of events, but the individual human stories that make history real, complicated, and ultimately meaningful. Thank you for being part of this community that believes the past is not dead, that it speaks to us across the years, offering lessons about human nature, about conflict and reconciliation, about the choices we face and the world we can build. Until next time, keep these echoes of history alive. Keep asking questions, keep seeking understanding, and keep believing that even in the darkest moments of human history, hope and redemption are possible. This is Wardiere. This is the story no one tells, until now. The story of when the Axis bombed America. And the story of how an act of war became a symbol of peace.